Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today we're going to be talking about the original Xbox, and specifically how it got a backwards compatibility update for the Xbox One and the Xbox Series X, giving it a bunch of new games. I'm looking forward to talking about it. Before we do that though, please do me a favor, like this video, comment down below, subscribe if you haven't done that already, and hit me up in the description. There's a bunch of social media stuff, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, all that stuff. Follow me on those places, and I have a brand new channel called Flying and Eating, which is I fly around a lot and I eat stuff, so I thought I'd film it. Why not? And you can go see all that. Anyway, thank you very much. Links to all that stuff's in the description. Thank you. Now, let's talk about the point of this video. Backwards compatibility. Now, at the time I'm recording this, Microsoft just celebrated the 20th anniversary of our friend here, the original Xbox, one of my favorite consoles of all time. And they actually decided to kind of surprise everybody, even though there were a lot of leaks and stuff coming up about it about a month before, by adding new games from this system to backwards compatibility for the Xbox One and the Xbox Series X. They also decided to do the same with the Xbox 360. Let me give you some specific numbers. They came out and said 76 new games, which is a tad misleading. Because only 21 of them, although I would actually argue 22, are original Xbox games, and 55 of them are Xbox 360 games. So the Xbox 360 really took the lion's share of the update, but still, the fact that the original Xbox got that much attention and love is great. So let's, before we go into the specifics of like which games were added and all that sort of stuff, I thought we should talk about kind of how we got to this point, because I feel like this is probably realistically the last time we'll ever get to talk about one of these updates, because Microsoft is now like, we're done with this. We're not doing this anymore. And to their credit, they want to, but they can't. And we'll get back to that. Or at least they can't to a certain extent. But again, we'll get back to that. So basically, if you're not familiar with the concept of backwards compatibility, it's the core idea that when a company makes a console, then they upgrade to a new one. They basically take the old games with them and make them work on the new machine. So I think the most infamous example of this is going from the PlayStation 1 to the PlayStation 2. Sony did it really right. You know, they basically said, like, we're putting all the PS1 hardware in the PS2, and so your original discs you've got, just plug them in, they just work. You don't have to do anything special, there's nothing crazy, and it even does a little bit of enhancement here and there. That's really how backwards compatibility should be done. But different companies approach it differently, and Sony themselves, as well as everyone else, just kind of changes it up from generation to generation. So in Microsoft's case, when they went from the Xbox to the Xbox 360, they originally said, like, okay, we're not going to put the hardware of the original Xbox in the 360. Instead, we're going to emulate it. There's a whole big hullabaloo as to why they did that, but it's not important for this video. But they just said, we're going to do it through emulation. Ultimately, of the nearly 1,000 game library, they got about 500 of them to become compatible with the 360, which is good, not perfect, obviously. And even the ones that were supported, a lot of them, unfortunately, had some bugs and issues in it. But they were able to get that many because, well, frankly, they would just read off the disk and they were just loading via an emulator. And that's unfortunately a very big factor as to why this number was so small, but again, we'll get to that. They would eventually abandon that project, I believe, in like November of 2007. They just stopped supporting it. And then when the Xbox One came about, when asked about backwards compatibility with the original Xbox or the 360, they were just like, no. But of course, they had a very bad launch with the Xbox One, as we all kind of recall, I'm assuming. But eventually, they wanted to change their tone because they wanted some good PR. So they announced Xbox 360 backwards compatibility on Xbox One. However, it was going to be a curated collection because of the way they had to do it. And it would just be an individual game update at a time, you know, depending on whatever they could work out. And while that was great, and they kept adding to that, and they added quite a few 360 games to it, ultimately, there was some pressure on them. They were like, people were wanting original Xbox. Actually, myself, I know in 2014 at PAX West, I got to meet Major Nelson, and like the only thing I asked him was, are you ever going to add original Xbox support? And he sure have told me no, which is hilarious because they ultimately kind of did, although I don't fault him for that. That was their official position at the time. But anyway, so eventually at an E3, Phil Spencer announced they were going to add backwards compatibility. I did a video on it at the time. I was like, oh man, I was losing my mind because I was just so happy about it. But that's when we also found out how limited it was actually going to be. Ultimately, in its original run, they only added 40 games, or debatably 42, with 2 having a big asterisk next to them, which represents about 4% of the library. Not very big, before they eventually said, we're not doing this anymore. And then they started focusing on the Series X and the Series S. But at the time, they also said, hey, we might revisit it, but we're probably not going to. But then they did, and that's what we have now. But the sad, bitter sweetness to this is, as great as it is this came out, they also said, this is actually it. We're not doing this again. So while I love the 360, and I'm very glad they added 55 new games to it, it's not something I'm as passionate about as the original Xbox, so I thought I would just focus specifically on these. It is important to understand, though, before we actually show the specific titles, how this works, because people always bring up, like, dude, the hardware is great. Why don't they just release an update and all the games just work? Technologically, that's not the problem. It's actually like legalese reasons. It's more financial. So here's the thing. As I explained with PS1 to PS2, the console had the original hardware, or original enough hardware in it, that it was just reading the disc. So there's no license issue. You're just bringing the content you already have to the next machine physically. The way that Microsoft approached the Xbox One in particular was that when you put a disc in it, the console doesn't read the disc and play off the disc. It doesn't stream the data. Instead, it clones the data over to a hard drive, installs it all there, and then plays it off of that. Now, because of that, the console does not read the discs directly. It just installs stuff, and so it changes the legalese process. And so that really kind of matters when it comes to distribution. The other aspect to it was that, Microsoft probably, I'm guessing, looked at it and said, like, we don't want the emulator to have to depend on the speed of the disc. We would, and, the quality of a 20-year-old disc. So we would rather that we build a prepackaged bundle and give it to you that way. That way we can ensure quality control. So that's why if you take an original Xbox or a 360 game that is Xbox One or Series X compatible, it'll detect the disc. It's able to do that, but once it detects it, it doesn't actually extract anything from the disc. Instead, it just goes to Microsoft's cloud, which means you have to be online when you do this, by the way. And it just downloads a pre-assembled Xbox One or Xbox Series X build of the game and downloads it to your console. And then the discs themselves really just function as like an unlock key in order for you to actually play it. Now, the reason that matters is because they're doing it that way, they're no longer the original assets. In fact, they're also added to Microsoft's store for digital distribution, which essentially means they're being sold again. Right there is the reason you can't have a giant update that just makes all the games work, because they have to digitally resell it, which means money is involved, which means companies giving their permission is involved, which means money has to go to specific companies. So some companies may just not be willing to cooperate. Some companies may not even exist anymore. Certain games may have been a temporary deal where one character is owned by one company and another character is owned by another, and now they're split up and they hate each other, and so that game, nobody owns it, or they both own it. You know what I mean? Like, there's a bunch of... That's the problem when you try to bring older stuff to newer things without having some massive way of doing it all at once. So in Microsoft's case, they essentially went with path of least resistance. The companies that wholly owned those games and were willing to play ball with Microsoft, great, your games can be added. If there's any sort of like red tape or issues with it, throw it away. It really had nothing to do with which games the fans wanted the most, or, whatever. It was, I'm sure they tried in those cases, but usually it was about which games can we add where, like, one company who likes us just says yes and we just move forward. But in those instances where those games were added, they did a lot to upgrade them. They actually run in 4K, which is really crazy, at least if you're running it through an Xbox One X or an Xbox Series X. I think probably the Series S as well. So they run very nice. They obviously run faster than they ever did before. In a lot of cases, original Xbox games had DLC. In those instances, in most of them anyway, they actually gave you the DLC for free, pre-bundled into that package. So in some ways, it's actually like the best way to play any of these particular games. So it's very, very cool. Now, I think it's time we go ahead and actually talk about some of these specific titles. One that I missed in a previous video, because it doesn't really count, is this. This is Battlefield 2 Modern Combat. Now, the reason this is one of those two where it has an asterisk. The other one is GTA San Andreas. Now, the reason these are here is technically if you own this original Xbox disc and you put it in an Xbox One or an Xbox Series X, it will work. The issue is it doesn't actually have this build of the game. What it does instead is it downloads the Xbox 360 build. So yes, if you find Battlefield 2 for like $1, it's a Goodwill or something, and you feel like playing the 360 version, you can pop the OG Xbox disc in your Xbox Series X and play the 360 version. The same thing actually applies to GTA San Andreas. Now, in GTA San Andreas' case, that's an unfortunate situation because the 360 version of that game is notoriously bad. But technically they do work, but you aren't actually getting the original Xbox version of the game. So just thought I'd throw that out there. Now, I went ahead and I looked at that whole list of 76 titles that they provided, which was stupid because they integrated them together. So they didn't denote like which one is a 360 game and which one's an OG Xbox game, so I had to filter it myself. The only time where that caused weirdness is they had a game called Conan on there. I was like, oh yeah, I have Conan for the original Xbox. That's not what they were talking about. They were talking about this Xbox 360 game. I have this obscure European-only release of a totally different game called Conan. So if you're like one of the 3 people in the world that owns this game, and you're in Europe, and you're like, dude, why doesn't it work? It's because it's not this game. It's the Xbox 360 game. There you go. There's your obscure bit of content for the day. But that said, now that we have that out of the way, these are the 21, or as I would actually say 22 games that were added. All of them I already owned except for one, and we'll start with that, and that's Gladius. Now, Gladius was a game by LucasArts. I had to go out and buy this specifically for this video. But this LucasArts is now property of Disney, and Disney has been super cooperative with Microsoft's backwards compatibility program. So it's really not surprising that they were like, yeah, everything we own, just throw it in there, that's fine. Gladius, I remember being a pretty good game when it came out. It was kind of a big deal, but I'd be lying if I said I really remember much about how it actually plays, but I just remember specifically everybody kind of loving it at the time. But there you go, Gladius is compatible. Now what's interesting about this one, as well as this entire stack here, is you remember before I said how Microsoft had like, the 360 was able to support like half the original Xbox games, and the other half it never added? When they were doing this program, they pretty much stuck to the half that already worked. But they added, like, I think it was Armed and Dangerous, which was also a LucasArts game. They made that compatible with Xbox One, despite the fact that it didn't work on the 360. However, for this update, like, as you can see, like, half of them here are 360 or original Xbox games that did not work on the 360. So this stack will work on this machine, an Xbox One, and an Xbox Series X, but ironically will not work on a 360. Whereas this stack right here does work on a 360. It's just kind of odd. Like, they had mostly been sticking to this side, so I'm glad they gave this side a little bit more backwards compatibility love. So, we've got Advent Rising. This is another one of those games where I remember this being a really big deal when it came out, and it's a game that I don't think too many people remember anymore. So it's very cool that that's an option now. This one is a perfect example of a game where no one asked for this, but the only reason it's on there is just because Path of Least Resistance, a company that likes Microsoft and is willing to work with them, owned this outright and gave them no issues, which is Disney's Chicken Little. Like, again, this is a movie license game from a mediocre film from like 2005. There was no reason to add this other than the fact that Disney was like, here, just take all of our stuff, and this was just happened to be one of them. Perfect example of why licensing can cause issues. Another company that was super cooperative was Sega. They already had some added previously, but they added a bunch this time around, which was really cool because a lot of these are like high demand games. Gunvalkyrie, this was originally supposed to be a Dreamcast game, was canceled very late. So to see this game not to evolve all the way from the point where it was supposed to be a Dreamcast game, but to be on the original Xbox and now the Series X, very, very cool. Speaking of Sega, Otogi, Myth of Demons, as well as Otogi 2. What's cool about these is that they have become, not that much on the original Xbox is super expensive, but these are actually up there. So while I obviously want my original discs and my original editions and all that sort of stuff, physical editions, there's a lot of people that couldn't play these and really wanted to, where now they can actually acquire them digitally via that program. So if you like these games, you want to revisit them, technically you have that option, but I will remind you, if you do have the original discs, they work. It's funny, like, I posted photos online of, like, me installing all this, and people thought I spent, like, hundreds and hundreds of dollars to digitally rebuy these things. I'm like, this was free, dude. I already own these, except for Gladius. These were all free. I just popped them in, and they just work. Keep your discs. But again, back to Disney. Secret Weapons over Normandy, also LucasArts. This, I remember playing the crap out of this years ago. They added a bunch of Star Wars stuff. Star Wars Starfighter. This game was really cool. I remember playing this for the PS2 originally, and then like a year later, they released an Xbox version that was like the definitive edition with a bunch of extra content, ran a higher resolution, all that sort of stuff. And it's a lot of fun. It really, really was a lot of fun. And now it's runs in 4K on the Xbox Series X. It's great. Star Wars Jedi Outcast, Jedi Knight 2. Again, not surprising for the reasons already cited. What's actually kind of interesting about this one is I think we could have predicted this one because, aside from Disney being cooperative, which is this game has actually been re-released now for the Switch and the PS4, so it's kind of cool, actually, because while Nintendo and Sony are, I guess, I mean, you can't really blame them, it's not their game, but you have to rebuy it on those ecosystems, whereas if you were still sitting on your 20-year-old original Xbox disc, hey, go nuts, it's free right now. Gotta give them props, man. TimeSplitters 2, as well as TimeSplitters Future Perfect. These were both made by Free Radical. The original was done by Eidos, and the newer one was made by EA Games. I don't know who owns the rights to these games now, if one of them owns both, or the other owns both, or they just magically both cooperated. I don't know the specifics of that, but I can't see any way these didn't both get added without having the same rights holder. What makes me sad about this, though, is these were both made by a company called Free Radical, who made one of my favorite hidden gems of all time, which is a game called Second Sight. It's on Xbox, GameCube, PS2. That game never got compatible. That one was never even made 360 compatible. I loved it, but it's still completely locked to this console. But there you go. I was hoping when they I saw those, I was like, oh, maybe, no. But anyway, so that's it for those. And then to the next stack, these were again compatible with the 360, but now even more compatible across the board. This is the one that causes the 21/22 distinction. Dead or Alive Ultimate. Microsoft considers this one game. I essentially consider it two, because it is. What you get here is Dead or Alive Ultimate 1, which is an interesting conversion, because Dead or Alive Ultimate 1 is Dead or Alive 1 that was on the Sega Saturn and the PlayStation. And, like, they upgraded the crap out of it for the original Xbox back then. Then, now it's got like a 4K massive update for the Xbox Series X. So, yeah, Tecmo is obviously super on board, as you'll see here. But that, of course, also includes Dead or Alive Ultimate 2, which was originally a Dreamcast game. And then they updated again for the Xbox. That one didn't have as much of an upgrade as, DOA 1 did, because it was the same generation. But they basically made, like, the definitive edition. And then now they've got that running on the Xbox Series X. So, there you go. Of course, Dead or Alive 3, they went ahead and added. This was a big deal when it came out because this was one of the early original Xbox exclusives. And this was pretty much the only reason anybody in Japan actually bought an original Xbox was just this game. And that's actually, I think, why they ultimately did this, because it had a better chance. I didn't mean that pun, but that's why they, oh my God, I just did it again. This is why I think they made this version too, is just because it was actually helping them push units in Japan along with that beach volleyball stuff. But that stuff was not made compatible. But this was. So you can check that out. You know who else was they also had a Dead or Alive 4 for the 360, even though that's different. I just like that all the Dead or Alives are kind of all in one family there. Another company that was cooperative and yet surprisingly not, well, actually not surprisingly, mysteriously, also not cooperative was Rockstar. And I think you know where I'm going with this. They added a few of their games. We got Manhunt. This was a big deal when this came out because this was one of the games they did pretty much right after they were doing GTA. After they blew up with GTA 3, like everyone wanted to see what Rockstar was doing. This was one of those early games where they're like, dude, because this was one like a crazy, gory, violent game. They ultimately would have a sequel on the Wii and the PS2, but the original best version of that is going to be this. Maybe there was a PC version, I'm not sure. But having this now run native in 4K is so awesome. Again, speaking of Rockstar, they added Max Payne 1. At one point, this was supposed to be a Dreamcast game, and I think it was very late cancellation, but we did get it on the Xbox, as well as Max Payne 2. So it's kind of cool that they have those. They also had a Max Payne 3, again, 360 game, but Rockstar put all three of them out there. What's interesting about that, and I'm sure you know where I'm going with this, is that the GTA trilogy was not added. And we all kind of know why. They wanted to release their own botched version of that. Well, how sad is that? I mean, like, GTA San Andreas, as we said before, kind of works, but it's not really the right version. It's the 360 version. If they had done the proper, like, emulated version of GTA 3, GTA Vice City, and GTA San Andreas from the original Xbox on the Xbox Series X, I think that would have been very embarrassing for them because it would have worked so much better than the actual product they put out. But that's another one of those rights conflicts because Rockstar ultimately made that decision. They had the right to say, no, we don't want that game to be compatible, even though everybody would like it, because they wanted to resell it on their own. Now, they probably did it that way because then they could sell it across the board, and they'd have 100% of the control over that. Whereas the irony is, if they had actually allowed the backwards compatible version to exist, people could still buy it, at least in the Xbox ecosystem, and it would actually have performed better. at least as a game. I don't know how it would have performed sales-wise, but that's what I mean when I say there's like legal tugs. You know, like one company can stop that from happening. That's why you can't just have one big update and say like they all work. It doesn't work that way. This is one that I'm surprised wasn't originally added. Oddworld, Munch's Odyssey. This was a big deal for the Xbox when it came out. This is a launch title. This is one of the few exclusives they actually had. They had basically taken a Sony franchise at the time, or what was considered a PlayStation franchise. It wasn't actually Sony's, and brought it over to the Xbox and like, see, this is real. And this was, you know, theirs. They're one of. I mean, for a while, I remember the Oddworld characters were kind of considered. There was a minute there, like right at the beginning, where the Oddworld characters were kind of considered like Microsoft's mascots until Master Chief obviously took over, even though technically Halo was also a launch title. But anyway, what I'm wondering about this is like, okay, this game got re-released via the Switch and the PS4. So it makes me think that that had something to do with this either being not part of the original run, like they're like, oh no, we don't want to do that because we're releasing it here, or because they knew they were refreshing everything, that gave them the option to release this. Because that's what happened with the Sphinx game, the Sphinx Curse of the Mummy. I did it like a few years ago when they did the other update. I talked about that. They had suddenly refreshed that game, thus they could include it in the program. That might be the situation here. Again, Rockstar. Red Dead Revolver, the game that obviously the first Red Dead game, the one that everybody kind of forgets ever existed. The fact that they made this compatible just to kind of, you know, actually complete that whole set so you can get this as well as Red Dead Redemption 2, etc., all on one platform, pretty cool. Again, LucasArts. We've got Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Kind of cool, actually, because this is another movie license game, specifically. Like, yes, it's Star Wars, so it's kind of like its own thing, but technically it's a movie tie-in game, so for that to be made compatible is fundamentally funny. But again, LucasArts, property of Disney, so they were like, just throw them all out there. Well, with one exception. We also had Star Wars Clone Wars. This one is not a game I think anybody really remembers all that well, but I could be wrong. Although this was a pack-in at one point, so maybe I'd take that back. It was also packed with Tetris Effect or whatever it was. But there you go, you got that. But funny thing about that, I was saying Star Wars, you know which game is still oddly missing and will probably intentionally so. The original Xbox had an exclusive Star Wars game called Star Wars Obi-Wan that nobody liked. And so that's the one that will probably never be added because I think everybody just forgot about it. But the last one up is also LucasArts, and that's Thrillville, which was like a park simulator, a theme park simulator type of thing. But, I mean, and that's it. That is the swan song, apparently, of the original Xbox backwards compatibility for the Xbox One and Xbox Series X. So, you know, as much as I would love to see this continue, Phil Spencer basically came out and said as much. Like, the issue isn't that they don't want to do it. It's really just comes down to licensing problems, which is what we were kind of alluding to before. You can't get everybody's permission because it gets too expensive. And frankly, this is just like a fan thing. Like, there's not enough money in this, in backwards compatibility, for them to do that kind of effort financially. But they tried. You got to give them props. Like, Sony didn't do this. Nintendo didn't do this. And so now we are sitting at 64 is the highest number that you can argue are compatible original Xbox games, but there's 3 asterisks to that. One is Battlefield 2, because it's not really the OG Xbox version. Again, GTA San Andreas, also not really the OG Xbox version. And then Microsoft themselves would only consider this one game, while I personally would consider it 2. So the number goes as high as 64 and as low as 61 games that were made compatible with from the OG Xbox to the Xbox Series X/Xbox One, making just over 6% of the library compatible. It would have been nicer if that number was higher, but the fact that they did it all is great. They also included a bunch of free DLC, and not that this is about the 360s though, but that one also had a lot of stuff drop, and that one is cool because a lot of the DLC transfers as well and becomes free. So there you go. I hope you guys appreciate this. Another little trip down memory lane to look at the OG Xbox one more time, as well as a good chunk of its library. Well, not really. It's actually a small percentage. That's the whole problem. But regardless, thank you guys very much for watching. Remember, if you have any of these discs, just pop them into your Xbox One. Pop them into your Xbox Series X. Let them download. Go ahead and play them. And play them in better than they've ever looked. I just think it's not really the preservation of physical media, because that's, I tweeted about it and people thought I was just buying these digitally. Like, the idea that you might actually still have the discs laying around apparently is crazy to people, but retro gamers is what we do. Anyway, that doesn't really matter. Thank you guys very much for watching. Again, if you could please like, comment, subscribe, follow me on all the social media stuff in the description, and check out the new channel. I very much appreciate that. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.